Welcome back to A Layman's History of War. Today we're looking at a period of history I, frankly, know very little about. And if your education was anything like mine, you may not either. Ancient China is not a place and time most history courses in American high schools and universities go very deeply into. I learned a lot more about China from Laszlo Montgomery's excellent China History podcast than from any of my history classes. And even Laszlo largely skips over the period we're going to be talking about today as more mythology than history. That's how history works. Go back far enough and events that change lives and influence the course of events for thousands of years after have faded into myth. And at some point, all we can do is try to read between the lines and make an educated guess at the general shape of what might have happened. But myths don't usually rise from nothing. There's usually something there, especially if the myth gives us a link to a real person or place. That's why we're looking at these battles today. It's why we looked at the Siege of Uruk in another video, and why we'll look at the Trojan War when we get there. And as murky as historical records are from so many periods, we'll probably deal with this kind of thing a lot. It's also why we're combining these two battles into a single episode instead of looking at each of them separately. Together, they form a part of China's origin story, but there's so many supernatural elements woven into these stories that it doesn't make sense to do our normal principles of war analysis. You can see I don't have my whiteboard here with the generals' names on it and the principles listed out. Instead, we have our butcher paper with all the principles listed so that as we can highlight them as we come to them. So instead, we're going to look at the traditional Chinese stories of how these battles went down, and then we're going to spend a little time trying to figure out what might have happened in the real world. Before we start, though, I just want to remind you that I'm from Texas. I've got a pretty good education, but there's no way in hell I'm going to get all these Chinese names right. So if my Chinese pronunciation hurts your ears, well, I'm sorry. I promise I'm doing my best. So today, we're looking at the battles of Banquan and Zhuolu, both of which occurred in eastern China sometime around 2500 BCE. First, we're going to talk about the participants and their tools. Then we'll go through the traditional stories of these two battles. And finally, we'll try to tease out a plausible explanation for what might have happened and discuss why we should care about a pair of 4,500-year-old battles that we can't even know that much about. So who are we talking about here? First, our protagonist for these two battles is Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. Now, if you were in class the day you studied China in your world history class, Huangdi might sound familiar to you. When I was in high school, I heard the name of China's first emperor pronounced Shi Huangdi. First of all, this is wrong. The Chinese pronounce the name of their first emperor, as nearly as I can get anyway, as Qin Shi Huang. And second, even if the first pronunciation was correct, it's not the same guy. Qin Shi Huang united the warring states under his rule around 221 BCE. Huangdi reigned as Yellow Emperor more than 2,000 years earlier, about 2500 BCE. And if you think 2 millennia doesn't matter because it's all so long ago, well, think about how you would feel if somebody confused George Washington, who sometimes you'll hear called the American Cincinnatus, with the real Cincinnatus, who was a consul of the early Roman Republic. The time separation is similar, as are the parallels in their lives. So Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, is our protagonist. The only other two named characters in these stories are Yandi, the Flame Emperor, and Zhuolu, the leader of the Zhuoli tribe, who for some reason doesn't get an imperial title, maybe because he's a demon. Yandi and Zhuolu will be our antagonists. The other character I'm going to name here is the historian who wrote down the history of these battles, a legendary ancient Chinese chronicler named Sima Qian. His history, Records of the Grand Historian, was completed sometime before he died in 86 BCE. Yeah, 24 centuries after the events he described. Imagine if all we knew about Alexander the Great came from oral history until somebody decided to write the histories down this year. You might expect that story to be a little different from what actually happened. So in the records, we get ancient kings with the heads of men and the bodies of snakes, and we get armies of tigers and bears and winged lions going up against one emperor who breathes fire and another one who leads demons into battle. And we mortals have to figure out what might have happened in a world governed by the same laws of physics and biology that we observe today. In Chinese myth, the Yellow Emperor fills the roles of something like a Chinese Prometheus and Heracles and Julius Caesar all rolled into one. Not only did he lead his people, the Yushang, to victory in today's battles, but he's credited with inventing everything from the lunar calendar to boats to architecture to clothing. We'll get to at least one of his other inventions in a little bit. It's a little hard to figure out whether to think of the Yellow Emperor as a Neolithic ruler or an early Bronze Age ruler. I found sources that say people in China started using bronze as early as 3300 BCE and as late as 2100 BCE. 3300 puts it more or less contemporary with and maybe a little bit earlier than Mesopotamia and Egypt. 2100 puts it a long time later. Since modern-day China contains significant deposits of both copper and tin, and we know international trade networks were robust enough to move tin 2,000 miles from Afghanistan or Spain to Mesopotamia, I'm a little skeptical of later dates for bronze in China. So I'm betting the Yushang had bronze weapons during the time we're talking about. We'll talk about that a little more later. That said, a plot point of the Battle of Zhuolu is the Zhuli demon armies attacked with bronze weapons, which would mean these battles happened right as China was making the transition from stone to bronze. We're going to talk about that. But the weapons we're talking about are probably similar whether they were made of stone or bronze, and not much different in form to their Western counterparts, axes, spears, and bows. If they had bronze, they might have had longer daggers than they could make from stone, but it doesn't look like they would have had swords this early. Strangely enough, I didn't find any mention of clubs or maces like we saw at Uruk, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. A standard weapon of Bronze Age China was the Dagger-Axe, a hafted weapon with a narrow axe blade on one side of the head and a short dagger blade on the other. But 2500 BCE seems to be a little early even for that. So it looks like we're talking about spears, axes, and bows today. And slings. Pretty much any ancient battle is going to have slingers throwing rocks. They're a little like the hunting rifles of the ancient world. Every shepherd and his boy has one, and if you need a bunch of guys in a hurry and don't have time to train them, slingers are what you're going to get. These battles are at least 500 years from horses being domesticated and about 1,000 years from the first archaeological evidence of armor in China. So no cavalry, no chariots, no armor, although it seems likely that some of these guys would have figured out maybe thick leather caps and maybe lashed a few bamboo stalks together to make a primitive sort of shield. Guys tend to get pretty ingenious when their asses are on the line after all. So, we've got infantry and nothing else. It's likely these armies would have had a core of heavy infantry, being the biggest, healthiest guys with the best equipment and probably the best training. Supporting them would be a couple of different types of light infantry, mostly armed with ranged weapons like archers, slingers, and maybe some javelin throwers. And supporting them would be a whole nother army of camp followers, mostly the wives and daughters of the combatants whose job would be to cook and maintain clothing and provide medical care and other services. What kind of other services? Well, let's just say we're talking about large numbers of young men traveling together and occasionally putting themselves in mortal danger. And surviving mortal danger is a hell of a boost to the old libido. I can't find anything on how many soldiers might have been engaged in these battles, but to be honest, as much myth as these stories are shrouded in, I wouldn't feel comfortable with the estimates anyway. Hell, as little as we know about these battles, the numbers really aren't that important. Okay, enough about the equipment and logistics. Let's get to the stories. A lot of the online sources I found are pretty bare bones. Most of them just parrot the same couple of lines about the battles, especially Banquan, then move on to a more general discussion of who the Yellow Emperor was. My guess is most of the stories are out there in Chinese. I'm from Texas. I don't speak Chinese. But I wanted the stories for the same reason you want to read the Iliad to learn the bones of the Trojan War before you try to study the archaeology. Because there's truth in stories, even when they didn't really happen the way the stories tell it. So, I found a guy on YouTube. Api No, the Chinese history guy who calls himself the chain-smoking writer. He has a whole series on Chinese myths, of which these two battles are episodes 11 and 12. How accurate are his retellings to the traditional myths? I have no way of knowing. But he's entertaining and his videos sound like real myths to me. So he's the source I went with. So, according to that Chinese history guy, there were three main tribal groups living in what is now eastern China in the area roughly between the border with Mongolia in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. These tribes were the Yuxiang, ruled by the Yellow Emperor Huangdi, the Xinzheng, ruled by the Flame Emperor Yandi, and the Zhuoli, ruled by Zhuolu. The Yellow River, one of the largest rivers in China, is the main waterway through this territory, and most of it runs through Yuxiang lands, which lie north of the other two. The Yuxiang and Xinzheng lived in the highlands to the north and west of this territory, while the Zhuoli lived in the lower coastal plains to the west. The south was the territory of a tribal group called the Miao, who never get a named leader, but will come into the story when we talk about Zhuolu. If I understand the story right, Yandi requested Huangdi's help in putting down a rebellion by Zhuolu and the Zhuoli. Huangdi, seeing an opportunity to become the most powerful of the three rulers, was happy to oblige. And when he had put down Zhuolu's rebellion, he started loudly tooting his own horn to any of the minor tribes who wanted to listen, and probably quite a few who didn't. Zhuolu, smarting from his recent defeat, was happy to carry news of Huangdi's antics to Yandi, undoubtedly embellishing the tale quite a bit in the telling. But to be honest, if he went to Yandi with stories about how Huangdi was making a play to become cock of the walk, it doesn't look like he was too far off. Yandi responded as you might expect he would. He raised a huge army and marched north, meaning to overwhelm Huangdi and the Yuxiang and become cock of the walk himself. But Huangdi wasn't just talking a big game. It looks like he was ready to throw down. After leading Yandi north with a series of strategic retreats, including allowing himself to be defeated at the battles of Henan and Hebei, he lured the Xinzheng into battle at Banquan, a place he knew well, a place he was prepared to fight. So all that about strategic retreats and allowing himself to be defeated, yeah, that's all examples of maneuver, right? Possibly objective if he's doing it all towards if he's allowing himself to be pushed back into an area where he wants to be. And I'm going to take a minute for a couple of sidebars here. The first one is I'm not sure why Chinese history marks Banquan as their first major battle when it pretty explicitly follows two other named battles as part of the same campaign. The most likely explanation is that Henan and Hebei were big enough to get names but not important enough to decide the result of the conflict, which incidentally is what we mean when we say a battle was decisive. So maybe it's more accurate to say Banquan is the first decisive battle in Chinese history. The second sidebar is to talk about the importance of terrain to the outcome of a battle. We don't have any details on the terrain at Banquan, but it seems to be where Huangdi wanted to fight, which means it gave him an advantage. Now, there are a lot of ways a piece of terrain might give one side an advantage over the other, but the general rule is simple. The more force you can concentrate against your enemy, the more likely it is that the fight will go your way. That's maths, right? We've talked about that before. You can concentrate force by having more troops engaged than he does, or by sending fresh troops in against his exhausted troops, or by making his formation spread out so he can't bring his full power to bear where he wants to. The right terrain can do all of that. Choke points like canyons and bridges force an attacker to narrow his front so a smaller force can concentrate against him as he comes out. High ground forces an attacker to climb up to where his enemy waits, forcing exhausted troops to face fresh troops. And rocky or marshy ground can break up an attacker's formations and force him to slow his attack. In a nutshell then, it was a little bit silly for Obi-Wan Kenobi to suggest that holding the high ground means the fight is over. But the right terrain can significantly reduce the advantage a larger force has over a smaller. We'll see that play out again and again as we go through our history. So Huangdi lured Yandi to Banquan, where he wanted to fight. Yandi opened the battle as you might expect from a guy called the Flame Emperor by sending fire to scorch the land and burn Huangdi's troops to cinders where they stood. Huangdi responded, as you do, by invoking the spirits of storms and rain to put out the fires. Then he counterattacks by sending armies of beasts, tigers, bears, wolves, even winged lions against the Xinzheng. Yandi committed his entire army against the beasts, and the battle raged furiously for days. But every battle comes to an end, and when the dust settled, Huangdi and the Yushang stood in possession of the field, presumably with what was left of their beast armies standing with them. The result of the battle was pretty much the end of the Xinzheng as a tribe, but it was also the end of the Yushang. The two peoples merged into the Huaxia, and this semi-unified cultural group eventually led to the unification of what would become the Chinese people under the Qin, 2,000 some odd years later. That's what the chain-smoking writer says. My other source, which I admit is Wikipedia, says the two tribes merged to form the Yanghuang under Huangdi, and it was not until after the Battle of Zhuolu that all three tribes merged to form the Huaxia. Spoiler alert, by the way. Either way, Huangdi emerged victorious from the Battle of Banquan, decisively enough that Yandi agreed to follow his lead and recognize him as emperor over both peoples. Probably a pretty tough pill to swallow for a guy who thought he was the shit going into the battle. But there was another cock that wanted to rule the walk, and he thought he just might have a chance with both Huangdi and Yandi weakened by a large-scale multi-day battle. Zhuolu decided it was time to make his move. He started with raids into Yanghuang territory. We're not told the purpose of these raids, but small-scale raids by one power against another can be used as a device to goad the victim into a forceful response. It's easy for the instigator to deny responsibility for the actions of a few zealots or bandits or starving farmers, and then escalate in the name of self-defense when the target sends troops into the shit-stirrer's territory. I'm guessing that's more or less what happened here. But Zhuolu had an advantage, because in the time between his defeat by Yandi and his incursion into Yanghuang lands, he had discovered how to make weapons out of bronze. Not only that, he had made allies of the demons who lived south of the Yangtze River, the Miao. So, an army of demons armed with bronze weapons marched against Huangdi's brand new coalition, possibly still armed with stone. And their first engagement went about as you might have expected. Huangdi and his beast armies fled from Zhuolu's demons. But Zhuolu still had a trick up his sleeve. He blew a dense fog out of his nostrils that caused Huangdi and his beasts to lose their way. Now, if you've ever been stuck in a really thick fog, you know it can be a pretty scary experience, especially if the fog is so thick you can't identify familiar landmarks to help you get your bearings. Even if the sun is shining, the light is diffuse enough that you can't tell which direction it's coming from. Without a compass or some other way to tell what direction you're facing, you can't even tell whether you're walking in a straight line. So there they are, lost in a dense fog with no idea where they are or which direction to go, with an army of demons that just kick their asses nearby. They're not just lost. If the fog is thick enough, they can't see more than a few guys right near them. And if they think the enemy is nearby, they're not going to be shouting to each other to try to maintain contact. They're going to stay as quiet as they can, huddle together in 2s and 3s and 4s, and try to get out of the fog so they can figure out where the hell they are and what the hell is going on. It's the worst kind of uncertainty you can imagine, because for all they know, the entire army is dead except for the people in their little group, and the demons are prowling through the fog looking for survivors to kill. It's times like that when leaders earn the confidence and trust of their soldiers, or not. A leader who can keep his head and figure out how to lead his unit out of a situation like that, maybe picking up a few more stragglers on the way, will have their loyalty forever. Huangdi kept his head. The story tells us he got his guys out of the fog by inventing a device called the south-pointing chariot, a vehicle on wheels with a pointer on its top that can be set to face the same direction no matter which way the vehicle turns. Remember how they couldn't tell in the fog whether they were traveling in a straight line? Well, with their south-pointing chariot, they could. So they managed to escape the fog, but they couldn't figure out how to defeat Zhuolu and his demon armies. Again and again, Huangdi tried to bring him to battle, and again Zhuolu drove the Yanhuang armies back. And this time it was no strategic retreat like Huangdi had used to lure Yandi to Banquan. The Zhuoli and their demons were driving the Yanhuang steadily back, taking territory they had no hope of reclaiming until they could figure out how to turn things around. The story gets a little mythical at this point. Huangdi has a dream where a goddess gives him all the secrets of military success. He has his men climb a mountain to hunt a dragon with a human head whose roar causes earthquakes. He has them go into a swamp to hunt a thunder beast whose hide claps like thunder when it's slapped. And when they've killed both of these creatures, he has their hides made into giant war drums and their bones into mallets for striking the drums. So, with their new tactics and instruments, Huangdi and the Yanhuang marched against Zhuolu again, offering battle at a place called Zhuolu. Zhuolu and his demon armies, expecting another easy victory, opened the battle with a wild charge. But instead of running in fear, the Yanhuang stood firm, waiting for the demons to get close enough that they couldn't abort their charge. Then they opened up with their earthquake drums and thunder drums, throwing a blast of horns in for good measure. The demon armies faltered in confusion, then, convinced the Yanhuang had brought an army of dragons to the field, started to draw back. Sensing the critical moment had come, Huangdi led a charge against a narrow front, penetrating deep into the Zhuoli rear to find and kill Zhuolu. Leaderless and disoriented, the demon armies allowed themselves to be enveloped. That's a military term for an attack from the side or rear of a formation, where the weapons aren't pointing. And the Yanhuang, overdue for payback, slaughtered them. The rest of the battle was more of a massacre than a fight. Finally, with his enemies destroyed and his power secure, Huangdi could get down to his important work, ruling his new consolidated lands and laying the foundation of a tradition of centralized control that persists to the present day. The newly united cultures of the Yanhuang and the Zhuoli started calling themselves the Huaxia, and before long the roots of the culture that would call itself Chinese had wound themselves deep into the land between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. That's how the myth explains the cultural unification of prehistoric China. More or less, anyway. It seems pretty unlikely that's the way it really went. For this segment, hell, for the rest of our time together, you need to bear in mind that everybody experiences history differently. Even in our age of just about every event being recorded on somebody's phone, we disagree bitterly about something that happened 10 minutes ago. And sometimes even the video isn't enough to get us to agree what happened. And these battles, if they happened at all, happened something like 4.5 millennia ago. That's before video, before photography, before the printing press. Even writing wouldn't be invented in China for another 500 years. All the sources we have for events this far in the past are the stories, supported or not by whatever archaeological evidence we can find. So how did it go then? Before we try to answer that, it's important to recognize the kinds of things we can't possibly know with any certainty, which, let's be honest, is almost everything. Did Huangdi and Yandi and Zhuolu actually exist? Maybe. They could be the remembered names of real rulers of real tribal groups. They might even have lived in the 26th century BCE. They might also each represent a collection of rulers who each did one or two things similar to the great deeds the mythical rulers are credited with. Were the three main tribal groups in eastern China unified by a series of battles that allowed one of the groups to rise to prominence over the other two? Possibly. It's a familiar enough pattern in world history, a pattern that would have been notably familiar to Sima Qian's audience in the early 1st century BCE, which also makes it a little suspect. Just because it happened more recently doesn't mean it happened the same way in the distant past. What about the rise of a supreme ruler, one strong enough to unite the tribes in his region? That one is certainly possible, since it's a pattern that's appeared over and over again in history with guys like Qin Shi Huang, Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Shaka Zulu. But often these sorts of empires don't last very long after their founders die. Only half of the guys I just named built empires that survived their deaths. And even Genghis Khan's empire only outlived him by a few generations. So it's entirely possible that whatever form Huangdi's confederation took, all that remained of it a couple of decades after his death was a shared cultural identity among people who still called themselves Huaxia, even as they went back to fighting among themselves. Since we can't know any better, then let's assume Huangdi and Yandi and Zhuolu and their respective peoples existed. How might these battles have gone in a world where physics is a real thing? No shit, there they were. We can start with the Banquan campaign. A campaign, roughly speaking, is the series of movements, maneuvers, and engagements leading up to a major battle. Staging a series of strategic retreats to draw your enemy into the ground you want to fight on is a great way to try to stack the deck in your favor. There's always the risk that your enemy might figure out what you're doing, outmaneuver you, and get between you and your chosen terrain. But Yandi doesn't seem to have done that here. He did try to improve his situation when he figured out what Huangdi had done, lighting fires to reduce the Yushang's advantage. He wouldn't have needed magic to use fire as a weapon on the battlefield. We humans have an instinctive fear of fire, and if he had a favorable wind, it could have been extremely effective. Likewise, Huangdi didn't have to call up spirits of rain and storms to put out the fires. All he needed was a little luck and a well-timed storm. Hell, it's possible Yandi noticed a storm coming and lit his fires ahead of it, thinking he would be able to do some damage to Huangdi's forces, but the storm would put the flames out before they could burn out of control. Because an out-of-control fire is every bit as dangerous to the guy who set it as it is to his enemy. There's a similar explanation for the bears and tigers and winged lions that made up Huangdi's army. Even today, military units take fierce animals like bears and wolves and tigers as their mascots. Today, it's a reminder to soldiers that they're supposed to be ferocious in battle. Now imagine it's the ass end of the Stone Age when bronze is a cutting-edge new technology, and many of the soldiers might still be worshiping deities that look a lot like bears and tigers. For these guys, carrying a banner or totem with the image of an animal they revere, whether it's real or imagined, can be a powerful motivator. So did they really fight for days on end? In a word, unlikely. At least not the way it's described. Hand-to-hand combat is some of the most exhausting work there is. And even if the armies are fighting in shifts and taking breaks for food and rest, they're going to need to rest. Not to mention the difficulties of fighting at night. There's a reason night battles didn't become common until reliable illumination and night vision became available in the 20th century. It's hard to see, which means it's hard to tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, and it's also much harder to know whether you're heading toward the right objective. Yes, we will see multi-day battles as we move forward, and night battles as well, but they are very much the exception rather than the rule. Much more likely that the bulk of the armies would go into camp at the end of each day's fighting, with the night hours limited to scouting and raiding and skirmishing. That said, battles tend to continue until one or both sides surrenders or quits the field, either because it no longer makes sense to stand and fight or because they can't. So if both sides had enough guys to keep fighting, they could have kept at it in the way we just talked about. So yeah, that's a long way to say yes. The battle might have lasted more than one day. But no, it didn't look like you're imagining. Now we get to the Zhuolu campaign with Zhuolu and his demon armies. The first question we need to ask is, how long after Banquan could Zhuolu's invasion have happened? Well, the stories make it seem like Zhuolu attacked shortly after Huangdi's victory at Banquan, but this seems unlikely to me for a couple of reasons. First, there's no hint of mutiny among the Yanghuang, even in the face of what looks like a pretty significant losing streak against the Zhuoli. You'd expect to find some tension between two groups recently joined into one. Hell, that's true even with voluntary joinings in the smallest groups. So how much more should we expect it in a forced union between two large groups? This makes it look like either Huangdi's and Yandi's people are much more alike than they are like the Zhuoli, which is possible. Or Huangdi has had time to consolidate his position as a trusted leader over both peoples, a process that would most likely have taken several years, and certainly more than a few weeks or months. And second, the story claims that Zhuoli attacked with bronze weapons while the Yanghuang still had stone. But recall that Yandi and the Xinzheng had defeated the Zhuoli right before Banquan, with no mention of better weapons on one side or the other. Now, it's true that a game-changing new technology might be adopted very quickly, but for a society without large-scale metallurgy to acquire enough bronze weapons in a few months to outfit an army doesn't pass the smell test to me. Could it have happened? Possibly, if Zhuolu traded for the weapons from a group that already knew how to make them, but try to imagine how precious these weapons would have been. It's a little hard to imagine a scenario in which a group capable of producing them at scale would be willing to part with them in any meaningful quantity for a price a would-be conqueror could afford. Maybe he conquered them and enslaved their metal workers, but even that would take more time than seems to have elapsed in the story. It's also possible that he may have just co-opted an entire tribe that was already using bronze weapons. It's possible that the Miao that worked for Zhuoli had bronze weapons. That's another possibility. But these questions lead me to think either the timeline has been compressed for the sake of the story, or all three tribes were already in the process of adopting bronze weapons, and the Zhuoli managed to get a little bit ahead of the Yanghuang. So, we're probably looking at 5 or 10 years between the two battles, if not more. What about the demon army? Remember that Zhuolu allied himself with the Miao tribes from the south. Some of these guys were separated from the Yanghuang by 2 river valleys and more than 500 miles. That's a pretty long way to travel even today. With no way to travel faster than a man can walk, it's the kind of distance few people would have traveled in their lifetimes. People from that far away would have been strange, wearing different clothes, carrying different equipment, speaking a different language with different customs. It's easy to see how Sima Qian, writing 2,000 years after the fact, could have made monsters out of them. The fog is easy to explain without Zhuolu blowing it from his nostrils. We've already established that Huangdi knew how to use terrain to his advantage. So when he learned the Zhuoli and Miao were marching against him, he would have looked for a place where the terrain would let him block them with minimal risk to his forces. His outnumbered forces, most likely, because the Zhuoli would have marched with an invasion army, while Huangdi may have had to scramble to meet them with whatever forces he had close by. They would have met someplace like a river valley, probably, since Zhuolu would have been coming up from the lowlands, and traveling along a river is usually a simple way to climb gradually into an area of higher elevation, and to find the people who live up there, since large settlements are often close to rivers. And you can use the river as a highway to bring supplies up to your army from friendly areas behind you. So the easiest way to find and stop Zhuolu would have been to watch for him coming up any river valleys leading into Yanghuang territory. Then move your army into a position uphill where he can't get past you without climbing up to you. The problem is that fog is common in wet areas like river valleys and coastal plains, and more common in lower and more southern climates, which means the Zhuoli were familiar with it and probably knew techniques for fighting in it, or at least maintaining contact, while the Yanghuang wouldn't have seen it very often. So the Zhuoli's weather advantage would have at least canceled out the Yanghuang's terrain advantage. So, if Huangdi was overconfident as the master of the highlands and had only brought a relatively small army expecting to smack down the lowlanders and go home, he might have been in a world of hurt pretty quickly. In a scenario like that, it's easy to see how a larger force could push a smaller force in front of it, especially after Zhuolu had established some momentum. What about the south-pointing chariot? It's a neat addition to the story, and it was a real technology, and it seems to be in keeping with Chinese mythology to credit Huangdi with its invention. The problem is there's no solid evidence of its existence until about the 3rd century CE, although Chinese tradition has its invention much earlier, obviously because we're talking about it in this story. Not only that, but Huangdi didn't have any horses to pull it. You could have people pull a device like that. It's not really a chariot in the sense we usually think of, but not only did it probably not exist, they wouldn't have needed it. Why not? Well, when you're fighting in a river valley and you find yourself mired in fog, there's a simple way to get out of the fog. You go uphill until you can see. Highlanders would know that because they would often have seen fog forming below them in the river valleys. Sure, some guys would go in the wrong direction and accidentally run into the enemy, but most of them would have been able to get away by climbing away from the river. So Huangdi was stuck on the upper slopes with his smaller force, while Zhuolu marched up the river valley more or less unopposed. If the season was unusually humid, the fog might have come back consistently day after day, preventing Huangdi from going down and engaging the enemy. So he sat above the fog, unable to do much more than watch as the Zhuoli and Miao got closer to his settlements. Good conditions for frustration and indecision to sap the morale of his army, and of Huangdi himself. So the Yanghuang were stuck, forced to just watch as an army they couldn't stop got closer to their homes by the day, as Huangdi racked his brain trying to come up with a way to stop them. It's pretty clear Huangdi was already a talented battle leader, so there's no need for a goddess to appear to him in a dream and give him the secrets of war. It's certainly possible that the answer to his problem came to him in a dream. It's also possible that he dreamed it after a trusted woman, a wife or mistress or mother or sister or priestess or advisor smacked him over the head and told him to pull his head out of his ass and figure it out. She may even have given him the bones of the answer he was looking for. Maybe something like, they're using drums to keep in contact in the fog. Why can't you do something like that? Likewise, no need to have his men hunt mythical beasts to get their skins to make drums. The Yanghuang were human, which means they already understood music and had their own instruments. Maybe he needed to make some tweaks to their existing instruments to make them more useful in battle, or in the fog, or maybe just to show his people these were instruments of war, no less important than spears and axes. Then he had to puzzle out how to use them in battle, as well as developing horn calls and drum rhythms that would have meaning for his troops but were distinct from those used by the enemy. And he had to train his troops to respond to them, and he had to wait for reinforcements to arrive from other areas across Yanghuang lands. And once he was ready, he would have moved his men into position, fog or no fog, and given Zhuolu the message, "Bring it on, bitch." Which was just the message Zhuolu was waiting for. After all, if you mean to conquer your enemy, it's much simpler to throw everything into one big battle and beat him decisively than it is to fight a guerrilla war. After that, the battle might have gone more or less like the one Huangdi originally envisioned. With the Yang Huang positioned as Huangdi wanted them, the Zhu and Miao charged. Huangdi might even have lured his enemies into a trap, ordering his front lines to give ground to entice the Zhu into a prepared killing ground where Yang Huang reserves already held the high ground on both sides of the valley. You can imagine the confusion that might have gripped Zhuolu's ranks when an enemy that had reliably run away in confusion turned and stood their ground using their own tactics against them. Instead of confusion and fear, they answered the Zhuoli's drums with a thunderous volley of their own drums, up until then concealed along the flanks. And the Yang Huang, thirsty for payback, fought like the wild animals whose totems they carried. Mass and maneuver. It's easy to see how something like that could morph into the charge of 100 dragons over thousands of years of retelling. Then, with the bulk of both sides engaged, Huangdi could have led a small force around the rear or through a gap in the lines into the Zhuoli's rear to kill Zhuolu. Assuming he was the driving force behind the invasion, the will of the Zhu and Miao to fight would have evaporated quickly after that. Finding themselves leaderless and surrounded, they might even have tried to surrender. But the Yang Huang were in no mood to honor their surrender. If they didn't have bronze weapons before that day, they did after. And the Yang Huang brought the Zhu into their confederation by killing as many of their fighting-age males as they could reach with their spears. And Huangdi became the undisputed leader of the new Huaxia Confederation. These battles are so heavily shrouded in myth that I'm not even going to try to rate Huangdi or Yandi or Zhuolu on our scorecard. Every part of the maybe plausible story I've just tried to pick out of the myth is a semi-educated guess on my part. Just one possibility of how it might have gone down. The real story, probably even the real characters, have been lost to us behind the mists of prehistory. Next time, we'll head back to the ancient Near East to talk about the Battle of Umma in 2450 BCE. Till then, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. See you next time.